Hi everyone. Thank you for joining in. We can see a few attendees are still coming in, so we'll just wait for another minute or two, and we'll start with the webinar. Thank you. Hi everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Data Trust, Is India Ready? That's the topic for today evening's discussion. Before we begin with the webinar, just a few housekeeping rules that you can see on your screen. The panelists will be speaking for 45 minutes, after which we will open up Q&A to the audience. In the interest of time, we request you to keep your questions concise. The audience may type in their question in the Q&A box, and the moderator, which is me, will relay it to the panelists. You can also upvote questions in the box. You can use the chat box to chat with the organizers if you're facing any technical difficulty or if you have any other questions. But we'll be taking questions to the panelists in relation to the topic only from the Q&A box. So that's where you can ask your questions. There's another thing which is not on this slide, which is that we're recording this webinar and it will be live streaming on YouTube. So just wanted to let everyone know that. And thank you again for coming on and attending. The Data Governance Network aims to develop a self-sustaining multidisciplinary community of professionals that can inform good governance practices and the trajectory of India's digital economy. We're a research network with 4 organizations: Internet Democracy Project, IT for Change, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and IDFC Institute. And IDFC Institute is also the secretariat of the network, which is an independent economic development focused think/do tank to investigate political, economic, and spatial dimensions of India's transition from a low-income state-led country to a prosperous market-based economy. We're doing this in webinar with Aapti Institute. Aapti is a public research firm examining the intersection between technology and society from the perspective of the lived experience. They've been working on questions of data stewardship. They've set up the Data Economy Lab, which is a space for research ideas and experiments on data stewardship. Before we move to the topic, I'd like to welcome and introduce the panelists. Astha Kapoor works on questions of the data economy and is currently leading Aapti Institute's work on data rights. She's the co-founder of Aapti Institute and has over a decade of public policy and strategy consulting experience with a focus on technology for welfare. She has experience in research with Future State and Seva, consulting with Microsave and Dalberg, advisory with APPI, and government with Planning Commission. And she has a master's from Institute of Social Studies and a bachelor's in history from St. Stephen's College. Welcome, Astha. Great to have you here. Sharad and needs no introduction, is the co-founder of iSPIRT Foundation, a non-profit technology think tank that works actively in the technology policy space and is focused on building the software product ecosystem in India. Sharad has also chaired the product forum at NASSCOM and headed Yahoo India's R&D, where he led product engineering for all emerging markets and some global products. He's also held senior R&D roles in Veritas, Semantic, Lucent Technologies, and AT&T. Welcome, Sharad. Great to have you here. Udbhav Tiwari is the public policy advisor for Mozilla, where he works towards keeping the internet open, secure, and accessible by advocating for progressive regulations in the technology sector. Prior to Mozilla, he was at Google's public policy team um, in India, and has also worked with the Center for Internet and Society, where he was the program manager and a co-rapporteur at the International Standards Organization. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce all of you. My name is Prakhar. I'll be the moderator for the evening. I work with IDFC Institute. The topic for the discussion is data trust, right? And data trust is relatively new when you talk about in the history of ideas, but have made a significant amount of progress already. What they enable at a philosophical level is to decentralize data, secure it when it is produced, and then aggregate it after, which is a very important function in using data. And specifically, there are two key ideas that they introduced, right? The first is separating collection and processing of data. And the second is giving agency and control to individuals who may have rights or interests over that particular data. And it has evolved across the world, right? So from a practical perspective, the Quayside project in Toronto looked at building a civic data trust. Conceptually, the Open Data Institute has pioneered the thinking and has been involved with the UK government in implementing some of these aspects. And technological advances have also been many, right? So Sightline Innovation, Bright Hive, Mozilla and Element AI, they've all been involved in building some sort of prototype, alpha product, technology stack, and I'm using these words loosely because I'm not a tech guy, but there has been technological advances on data trust here as well. With respect to India, there are two key things, right? First is the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is the law that is legislated, that is still being legislated in Parliament, which itself looks at individuals in specific, and communities or awarding of community rights is not something that it controls for at the moment. And that exact aspect, and that's the second thing, has been echoed in the recent non-personal data report by the Gopalakrishnan Committee, where they explicitly define data principals, data custodians, data trustees, and specifically data trusts, which are primarily looked at as institutional structures with rules and protocols to contain and share data, and with some oversight of public authorities to manage that data trust. Although, like, none of these reports are in any way the last word at the moment. They throw up more questions than answers, and therefore this time is great to discuss the idea of data trust as India looks at implementing its models, and for other countries as well to learn from how we're dealing with this. So I'll start with Astha, and Astha, you've done a fair amount of work on data stewards and data trusts, right? And data trusts are a subcategory of data stewards. Can you give us a quick snapshot of how power is structured in a data economy, and why there is an urgent need to reorganize it? And then what's the role of data stewards and data trusts in specific in the reorganization of a data economy?
Right. No, thank you so much for this. And we're very excited to be a part of this discussion. So, I mean, the way currently things are happening in the data economy is that you have a few big tech players that have a disproportionate amount of data, which is then in turn commodified. And in the process, the sort of use or control of the data is not with the people who generate it. It's not with individuals, it's not with communities, and in a certain way individuals are powerless in the data economy. Now there's a growing realization. I mean, a lot of writing has come out of it. There's Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism conversation that has been kicked off about what do we need to do to restructure the way data is organized currently, and where power lies with it. So in that conversation, we've been thinking about data stewardship, which is a set of governance principles, technologies that come together to unlock the value of data and do it in a way that is rights preserving. Now, why is there a need? Like I said, there's data that's being generated that is something that we are not necessarily benefiting from. There's also data that is generated that is lying underused and unused, and that needs to be unlocked and harnessed as well. So in that process, data stewardship is a potential solution that we've been working on. Now, data trusts is an idea that is being discussed quite a lot. Now, it is a legal instrument where you have a beneficiary, you have an asset, and Udbhav is the lawyer, so he'll be able to tell you a little bit better about it. But basically, it's a legal instrument that allows a board of trustees to decide on the asset in the interest of the beneficiaries themselves. So the way it would be structured is if it's our data as a group of people in this conversation, then we'd have a board of trustees that works in our interest on how that asset, i.e. our data, is managed. Now, this data trust as an idea is a very new one, and that's why it was interesting that it found mention in the NPD report, because even globally, there are very few examples, a lot of them as experiments and pilots. We don't really know what this instrument is. So the fact that a policy document coming out of the government of India mentions it is a little bit surprising, and also the manner in which it mentions it is also a little bit different from the way we've so far understood it as a legal entity. So that's why this conversation on data trust is an important one, and we feel like it's maybe a little bit early to start discussing the setting up of data trust, particularly for non-personal data, because we don't even know what that is. And of course, like you mentioned, we don't have a PDP structure in place. So to have an NPD conversation also seems a little bit premature.
Thanks, Astha. And just picking up from there, so staying at a conceptual sort of level and not going into the specific sort of operational ideas, there is Anup Ruhak, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's a Mozilla fellow, and she has mentioned that and I quote, data trusts are to the data economy what trade unions are to the labor economy. Stop quote. Do you agree with that analogy, or is there something that you think is over or under analyzed there in terms of the interaction of the labor economy with the data economy and the role of trade unions and the role of data trusts as the analogous counterpart?
Right. So that's obviously a complicated discussion about whether data is labor, and there's been lots that's written about it, and I'm sure there's no agreement on it. But it is interesting because I think that the assumption under that, or at least what I've understood from it, is that we are in a certain way, we are not in a position to bargain with technology companies and platforms at an individual level because of the way the relationship is structured. We don't know where our data is being collected. We don't know what we're agreeing to. We don't know what it's being used for. We don't also know how it's impacting our everyday lives. So we just don't know. So to collectively bargain in the data economy and find ways in which we can pool our data rights is essential. And data stewardship allows us to do that. Now, data stewardship can be structured in multiple ways. It can be, for individual empowerment, which is in some ways personal data stores that allow individuals to control and monetize their data. It can be in the form of collective empowerment, which gives groups the ability to negotiate, which is data unions and cooperatives that are also coming up. And then more broadly, it is a way of, like I said, creating societal value from data. So that can be in the form of collaboratives or even unions that are now coming up, or collaboratives that are coming up where health data is being pooled in a cooperative and then being unlocked for research. So it is, drivers are coming together on platforms like Driver's Seat is an interesting platform where it's a cooperative that allows drivers to pool their data and monetize it with city companies, but also allows them to create insights on where they're how much trips they're making or what their wages should actually be, and then use that data to negotiate and bargain with platform companies. So, fundamentally, there's a need to pool our data rights to be able to negotiate. Now, if that is an analogy to trade unions, then so be it. But I think that that's what we need to do.
And you do think data trust will enable this negotiation moving forward?
I think conceptually, data trusts may enable this negotiation. We just don't know what they are. So we need to test them much more before we decide whether they're a solution that works.
Clear. Thanks, Astha. Shifting gears on the operational side of things, and Sharad, coming to you next on the technology end of data trust. iSPIRT has been at the forefront of developing the technology architecture for India. And can you take us through what have been some very top line hits and misses of that, and how would they impact the operationalizing of data trust in the political economy of India. And if you can talk about your experience of building the different technology stacks you did, and how will that inform data trust?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, our core principle is that we don't go from an abstraction to a specific implementation. We think carefully about design use cases, and then we do exemplar first design and then abstract it away from there. So we pick a design case that we think is very complex, and if we solve for that design case, use case, then many other use cases will get resolved. So that gives us an insight, and that allows us to break away a little bit from the conversation of the day. And especially in these new areas, there are ideas that come in fashion and they go out of fashion, right? So we are able to stick with our ideas because they are anchored to Indian, very specific kind of use cases. So one of them, for example, that you've heard of often from us is, we focus on this use case of providing intraday credit to a street vendor called Rajni. And essentially, the KYC that we built was originally for Rajni. Now, of course, it's used by everybody else. And the Rajni use case is not yet active. So that's a design use case. We are still 2-3 years away from that coming to life. But many other launch use cases have come in place. The e-sign was built for her. DigiLocker was built for her. UPI was built for her. And now our account aggregator that you see, which is part of data empowerment and protection architecture, was built for her. We have PCR, Public Credit Registry, coming, which is built for her. And then recently we launched Open Credit Enablement Network. Now, if you see it this way, you can see how one design use case has powered so many things. And that keeps us very grounded and anchored. And while we can be very bold in our technology choices. So this is one. The second is that we do believe that for anything to come to life in India, we need 3 things to happen. One is you need public infrastructure. Digital public infrastructure has to come to life. If you go back as an example, back in 88, that was PAMSAT and INSAT. That was digital public infrastructure for satellite TV, right? Then there was Prasar Bharati, which led to Hum Log and all kinds of private programs being available on Doordarshan. And then there was private enterprise in the form of new studios. All the television channels that you see came from that era. They started in that era. So not only that kind of private enterprise, but also the small cable television operators that came up and wired Moradabad as a town, right? And so we in 7 years we were able to see a transformation in television watching in India because all these 3 things came together. Now we've applied the same principle for payments and had success. So clearly our thought process is we are not vested in creating a RuPay for beating Visa, MasterCard. We are not interested in saying RuPay Visa, MasterCard is really good. Can we take a replica of it and see if it will work in India? That's not where we come from. And we find that when we take the approach that we are taking, that's often not the answer that we end up with. Now, why am I saying all this? Is because I want to set a stage for discussion about data trust in this context. So data trust is one, but many kinds of intermediaries that we can have for protecting A, individual privacy, B, business secrets and business privacy, because business privacy becomes very important when you deal with aggregate data. So both of these are very important. And it's one type of an intermediary that can do that, create value, unlock value, send the value back to the people who contributed data to make it happen. And it's a good option, but it's one of the 4 or 5 options that exist, and we'll hopefully talk about some of the others. But how should we evaluate that option in India? That's an important consideration to keep in mind. Now, India has a very peculiar problem of the intermediaries not working well. Now, I would venture to say this is not just an Indian problem. Rogue intermediaries are a problem everywhere. We have auditors who audit on behalf of the public shareholders, but actually work for the promoters. So you have an ILFS, right? You have rating agencies which are supposed to rate for the sake of the bond buyers, but do it for the sake of bond sellers. And therefore, you have the 2008 real estate crisis that you had. right? I could go on and on. We've come to a world where we have toxic selling of mutual funds, where distributors who are supposed to recommend based on what's good for the person who is buying the fund, but they do it based on the commission they're getting. So we have, in this world, we are living through a failure of intermediaries. Rogue intermediaries are not just there in data. It is not just the tech companies that have become rogue intermediaries. We must realize that rogue intermediaries exist in almost any world that we are looking at, with very few exceptions. And so therefore, we have to go back to those first principles and say, where there are exceptions, what are those rules that drive that? And if there are rules that drive that, if there are market rules and policy and technology that prevent intermediaries from misbehaving, like our auditors saying one thing, doing another, right? Our rating agencies saying one thing and doing another. If we have to therefore keep them straight and narrow to what is needed, then what is it that works? Now, we know there is one thing that doesn't work in India, and that is the legal remedy, because legal cases don't get resolved. Right? So we therefore have to rely on more technology. We have to also pick those legal forms that will be suitable for India. I mean, there's no point pretending what works in London will work in India. Because the legals or what works in the US will work in India. Here, you'll file a case against somebody and you'll still be fighting it 10 years, 15 years later. So, to make sure this trusteeship concept is really applicable here in India and can be enforced, can be practically enforced, is very important. So therefore, what we believe is that the trusteeship concept has to be narrowed down. And I want to give this example for data. In the account aggregator, the trusteeship concept is only for consent. The data does not flow through that trustee at all. The consent manager does not see the data. And therefore, a malicious or a bad consent manager cannot have the bad influence. Now, do you need to do that in the US? You don't need to, because you can go and file a case against that guy and haul him to court, and 3 months later, he'll be paying a huge damages to everybody. Now, will that happen in India? It won't happen in India. So your architectural remedy for this has to be different. Now, we've done that for payments. In payments, our Google Pay or Phone Pay, they don't see money flowing through them. They see only consent flowing through them. We are doing 1.5 billion transactions a month on them. So we know there are alternate architectures that work, and they are suitable for India and work for India. And so we have to go back to first principles and apply some of this. Take all the good ideas from wherever we want, Canada, ODI and other places, but we have to test them in our Indian context and build it from first principles, rather than go into this model of, is this template the right template for India? That often doesn't yield the answers that we seek. So I can go more detail as we have time, but I just wanted to set the stage on how we look at data trusts in this context.
Right, no, clear. This is helpful, Sharad. Just to, and the law and technology question I'll take to Udbhav in a bit, but just to sort of stick with you on the operational end of things and what you talked about, the failure of intermediaries in terms of the lack of rules being there. So are you suggesting that there's some sort of a sequencing in terms of there needs to be some threshold of some sort of a structure that needs to be there in order for technology to develop such solutions? And with that in mind,
I'm going to offend some of the lawyers here, because I think there are two ways to come at this. And the middle ground is the best ground here. I think the lawyers tend to think that legal principles, legal provisions drive this. And the reality of this is that it's always been the case that law and the technology of that era interface with each other to provide a solution that works, right? So for example, if you want checks to be enforced in a certain way, right? There was a technology about check signing and being able to send the checks, to other places that allowed for disputes to arise and disputes to be notified and disputes to be settled, right? And until you have that process in place, you can't have any legal framework being effective in that regime. So the regime that we have to think about is a techno-legal regime, right? And I think our capacity, our legal capacity of dispute resolution is extraordinarily poor in India. We must recognize this. And therefore, we must build systems where disputes are minimized or they are recognized in a technology kind of a way. Right. And to the extent possible, they can be adjudicated in a way where you don't have to rely entirely on a very, very poor dispute resolution mechanism that we have. Now, when it comes to data, these are difficult disputes, right? And so therefore you have to design the system taking technology and legal framework together. You can't do it in isolation. A techno-legal approach is going to be more essential. And then when you anchor itself to an Indian use case, then it's very easy to see that this is what will work or not work, because you can have a discussion and say, hey, for Rajini, will this work or not work? Right. And so that becomes a convergence function for everybody concerned. And that is what we have to do. Right now, we don't do this. Right now, we hear of a cool idea from the West being promoted by think tanks there and say, hey, what are the minimum changes we can do to apply it here in India? That is the thought process that we have. And that doesn't take us very far.
Well, Sharad, just one last thing to you before I move to Udbhav is, given that the regulatory structure is not in place at the moment and very much is being baked, do you think the ecosystem, the technology development ecosystem is ready to actually build a sort of an Indian data trust and respond to this? And if not, what will it really take to get there? And I must preface 120 seconds for this because I need to move to Udbhav.
See, I think we clearly need intermediaries for aggregate data. There's little or no doubt about that. But let's also keep in mind that the intermediaries for aggregate data need not look at all like data trusts. And I must point this out because, and I think this came up in Astha's comments. See, don't forget that the Western idea of a data trust is influenced by their concept of data aggregators. I mean, even before Google came about, there was Axiom, which was a data aggregator that people are scared of. Many people have called it if at all there's a company that you fear, it is that company that you fear because the amount of data they have about you. And you can put in your last 4 digits of social security number and see what they have about you. And if you do that and you lived in the US, you will be scared to death. I've been away from the US from 2004, but since I hold a US credit card and still transact and buy books, there is information, believe it or not, on every book that I have bought in the US, and it's available for $300 for anybody that wants it. Right. And so the point is that they had rogue data aggregators. So they said, let's take rogue data aggregators and put trusteeship and make good data aggregators, and that is called data trust. That's not necessarily the answer for us at all. That's not even our starting point, by the way. Right. So I don't know that whether all I am willing to concede at this time is that we need intermediaries for data aggregators, but we should be very, very careful to understand where is this idea coming from, what's the genesis of this idea, what is the context, and in their context, it makes sense. In our context, remember, we don't have centralized data stores. For our DAPA architecture, the data resides with where it originated, and it goes to the data user without an aggregator in the middle. That's what makes our system better. That's why Norway, Denmark, and Netherlands are going to implement this as GDPR 2.0. So because this is a breakthrough way of thinking. This is not the old payment wallet. You first put money in the wallet and then some escrow will deliver it anywhere. We don't have a wallet system. We've beaten the damn wallet system. The money stays in your bank. When you use it, you can use it with the same convenience that you would have used with the wallet, but without having an intermediary who holds your data. So we have to rethink the intermediaries for data, for aggregate data. And I think there are some special cases where data trusts are right. But for majority of the cases, a different type of data intermediary will be the right one for us.
Thanks, Sharad. Udbhav, to come to you on the sort of the law and technology question, right? And what Sharad was saying in terms of they need to complement each other, but sort of law has its own limitations. The one thing that works when it comes to data trusts is that both the PDP bill and data trusts are trying to empower citizens. And that's the kind of language that they're using, right? And data trusts are bringing us closer to the world that is being echoed in law. Could you elaborate a little on what are some areas in the PDP bill that actually help data trusts come about, and what are those that don't, and how do we sort of square that circle?
Sure. Thanks, Prakhar. I think I'd like to start off by saying that we shouldn't have data trusts without a personal data protection bill. So unless there is a personal data protection bill that provides all the rights and protections that even the fairly weak bill that we currently have in draft form does, I think the idea of data trust is pretty much dead on arrival. And that's because so far in India, despite the fact that we have a Supreme Court that's said that privacy is a fundamental right, there's very little actual power available to any citizen or any group of individuals to enforce this right against anyone, right? Like even if I technically violate an individual's privacy, we have some incredibly vague provisions under the IT Act and the rules from 2011 that like create a framework, but like I'm, for example, personally unaware of a single successful enforcement action that has ever been undertaken in India in a court of law saying that X person has violated Y person privacy because of those IT Act provisions, right? So I think that in that sense, the Person Data Protection Bill should be a precursor to a data protection law. And regardless of whether there are specific enabling provisions that sort of allow for data trust to exist, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, I think that we should first advocate for a law being passed before we advocate for actually getting into the idea of data trusts. Specifically within the data protection bill, I think that like if you look at ideas like non-personal data regulation, right, which is probably the most concrete way in which like the Indian government and other parts of the sector have expressed a desire for data trusts, like there is an enabling provision in the data protection bill that allows the government to sort of create rules and regulations for non-personal data when it comes for public policy purposes. But I very much think that like data trust as an idea is so vast and is so nuance that we very much need a unique law and possibly even like unique regulation to govern how they would essentially be created. I think in order to understand this issue a little better, like I would like very strongly recommend that like we look at the case of the ADCU, which is the App Drivers and Couriers Union, which is based in Europe. And what they've actually done is that like the ACDU has actually filed cases both in the United Kingdom as well as in the Netherlands against Ola and Uber respectively in order to demand the data that these platforms have about drivers and couriers who utilize these platforms, right? So they've in a sense told Ola, why don't you give me all the data that you have about me on the basis of which you make A, B, C, D decisions, right? Like how much you pay me, like your like my rating and a bunch of other incentive rates. And what they've actually asked for is that for a copy of this data to be given not to them individually, but to be transferred to their union, which they are calling a data trust union. And the reason they're able to do so is that trust law in the European Union, and I mean, in certain states in the United States, I think is flexible enough to allow for this to take place and for these arguments to essentially take place. But despite that, the only reason this argument is taking place is not really because of trust law, but because of the GDPR, because of the fact that there is a right to algorithmic transparency. There is a right to sort of like know how decisions are being made about you. And I think a lot of these things are fundamentally absent in India's personal data protection bill. So I think that like while there are some things like provisions around consent managers, provisions around non-personal data, like, but they at best, they are enabling provisions, and we need to wait and watch and make sure that like there is a very active role played in when subsidiary regulations are created on these fronts, that we actually create laws and regulations to protect like the privacy of citizens rather than just like only looking at how it can be exploited, like either for the maximum bidder or for an individual who has access to a particular data trust, right? But and I think like much more importantly than all of this, I think are the hindrances that are present in the data protection bills, like that actually make it much harder, I think, for an idea of a data trust to come to like take force in India, right? And I think the biggest one among them are the government exceptions that are present in the data protection bill, because like in essence, and you could see this from the non-personal data report, the data protection bill contains like I think pretty much like unlimited leeway for the government to exclude itself from any part of the bill. And we've already seen from the non-personal data report that the government has come out with that they actively intend for the government itself to play the role of a data trustee or to manage the community rights of many individuals when there aren't enough entities that will play this role. And I think we need to be very, very wary of that, right? Because it's almost like a 1-2 punch where if you firstly allow yourself to be exempted from data protection provisions, and after that, make sure that you are the one who will be enforcing the rights, data rights of entire groups of individuals and of communities, like they envisage in the non-personal data report. I think the scope of influence that you have is much greater than just the traditional sort of government surveillance problems that we have with the government exceptions that are present in the data protection bill, right? Because the government is no longer bound to necessarily follow the provisions around consent, the provisions around data breaches, and many other things, even if it is running a data trust, because of the exceptions that are present within the data protection bill. So I think it's very, very important to be wary of that. And in general, I think like we also need to be careful like of the fact that like we don't jump from the frying pan into the fire, because I like it's very clear that there is a problem with the current sort of technology ecosystem, and there is need for a paradigm change in which the way in which people deal with data, right? But like I think if you look at India, the Indian technology ecosystem has a bunch of state, quasi-state, and private entities that have a disproportionate influence in regulation and its rollout, and we really need to watch like that process very carefully in order to make sure that it doesn't end up benefiting a few players. And the reason that's really important is because unless we necessarily do that, the entire like this idea of in empowering citizens, making sure that they have control over their data will be the guise under which much regulation will be passed without really like it benefiting them, but still benefiting like those intermediaries in between who are either powerful enough to create regulation or have enough political influence to get control or hold over various data trusts.
Got it. And just on staying with the law question, how does the federated nature of lawmaking affect the idea of data trust? So what happened in the European Union? Is there a union-wide, or do you have different countries or further different states? Because this becomes important for India, right? So what if the states pass their own laws trying to sort of regulate this kind of a technology? And how does that really play out in effect benefiting or not benefiting citizens?
I think I have like two responses to that, right? The first response is what is good for the ecosystem, right? Like businesses, civil society, and the government as a whole. I don't think that should take place. I think that like the federal government, like in India, and the central government should come forth with like a centralized law that governs this space. Even if you look at like the two closest laws that will govern something like a data trust in India, they are the Indian Trust Act and the Personal Data Protection Bill, and both of them are currently like federal laws. They are laws that are created by the central government because of how like powers within the constitution are separated, right? But I think we've already seen the dangers of what happens if the federal government does not act quickly enough. If you look at the example of state resident data hubs and what happened with Aadhaar information, I think like there is an incredible amount of like scary like occurrences that took place when states like Telangana managed to collect an incredible amount of information from their citizens during the Aadhaar enrollment process, and managed to do much more with it than many other states and even the central government did, simply because of the fact that there wasn't an explicit central government law prohibiting that. Since then, now that we do have an Aadhaar Act and many other things have come into place, I think many of these practices have been controlled much more. But I think the State Resident Data Hub is a very good example of what will take place if the central government does not act quickly enough to protect the privacy of citizens. And if that does not take place, I think we run a very real risk where under probably even well-meaning policy of empowerment of citizens, states might end up like doing things with data trusts that will ultimately be more harmful for citizens than they will be beneficial.
Thanks, Udbhav. Sharad, if I the point that Udbhav made to you, which is what can you talk about? Like we did discuss what's missing on the legal end of things and how that becomes a bottleneck. Can you talk a little about what's missing in the technology sort of end of things at the moment in order to make this a success? And what are some few sort of challenges in building that ecosystem as iSPIRT and others like you have done? Sharad, you're muted.
Yeah, so let's take what we are, just this session that we are having. Many of us must be using Wi-Fi to connect. Now, Wi-Fi is a standard that originated and it's managed by IEEE, right? Bluetooth, Wi-Fi came from there. We are also using a protocol here called the SIP protocol, Session Initiation Protocol, that's rampantly used in almost all our communications, right? Almost all our communication now is based on a session initiation protocol that came from IETF, right? Jonathan Rosenberg, who was one of the 4 founders of authors of SIP, went on to become a late co-founder for Skype, and make that a winning implementation. And then that's the the first IETF protocol that's there in our phone, right? And then of course, many of us must be Googling things here and there. So they're using HTML and HTTP. That comes from W3C. Now there are 3 different types of standard bodies. note for a moment, IETF has corporate members, company members, right? IEEE has corporate members, company members. IETF is only individuals. W3C always has, it's about 80 to 100 paid researchers so that they are independent of corporate interests, right? Because they work on what are called as heavier standards. Now, the important thing to learn is that even in a Western country, the US state or the Western state doesn't think they have the capacity to set the standards. Now, this humility does not exist in the Indian state. Our Indian state thinks they can do what the Western state doesn't think they can do. Right. So first of all, this is one problem. We've created lots of civic institutions that focus on the legal aspect of it. We have to create a vibrant ecosystem of technology standards organizations. We should have several organizations. We should have IEEE type organizations. We should have W3C type of organizations. We should have IETF type of organizations and more. Today we don't. Today, why don't we have that? Because standards body work is very, very long pole. It is very thankless for many, many years, right? Standards don't come together for many years together. And we don't have a culture of research. Even our companies don't invest in the standards process, right? We are mercantile nation. We can see the value of a sink in our bathroom, but we don't see the value of the plumbing, and we don't see the value of the protocols, the standards that allows the plumbing in the bathroom to connect with the plumbing in the building, and the building to connect with the city, and so on and so forth. So we are mercantile nation. We look everything at a shallow level. Right. So something that is plumbing and something that is protocols escapes us all the time. So we need to create, as part of our civic culture, a number of TSOs. And in fact, iSPIRT's goal is not to make iSPIRT bigger. We publicly announced n number of times that we don't want to become bigger. We want to create more iSPIRTs as we go forward, right? So because we as a country don't need one iSPIRT, we need a vibrant environment where there are competing iSPIRTs. And then you will get better answers, as a society, as to what to do and what not to do. So today what needs to happen is we outsource that to Western TSOs who have no context about India, nor do they understand the use case of India, the Rajni use case, nor do they care or understand about the context within which this technology and legal framework will operate. So we need to fix this as we go forward. So I would invite more techies to go back to deep tech, but for public good and for creating public good. And standards are definitely one kind of a public good. Platforms are another kind of public good. And we must dissuade the government from thinking that they can somehow do this on their own, because they don't have the ability. They can operate something that's been built for them, but I don't think they have the ability today to build it themselves. And that understanding has not happened yet.
So at a fundamental level, you're saying there's some sort of a cultural consciousness that needs to develop around building technology for public good and public service on that front, which can enable the technology ecosystem to deliver on complex ideas like data trust.
And complex ideas like data intermediaries I think we have a proposal for data intermediary for personal data. What we don't have is a credible proposal for data intermediaries for aggregated data. And I would say we need to figure out what are the data intermediaries, range of data, because there's probably not going to be one type, range of data intermediaries that we need for aggregate data. And I would say one of those types might be data trust, right? So I think we must broaden that discussion and be clear that we don't prematurely, line up for data trust just because ODI thinks it's a very good idea.
Right. Astha, if I can take that line of questioning to you, which is on this whole point of cultural consciousness, but in terms of the institutional structure and the financing side of things, right? So, I mean, you need money to sort of make these things. Do you think funding models and financing is available within India right now to sort of do this? And, traditionally we've seen the binary of public and private funding, but lately, and I guess lately it's just come into being, but even earlier the philanthropic end of things was also very, very relevant. So how do you see these three sort of, modes of financing playing out when it comes to data trust in the Indian ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, as Sharad and Udbhav has said that this is a very, very early conversation, and so the question of financing and sustainability is perhaps even later. But we've done some thinking about this, and I think that even whether it's account aggregators who we consider to be a data steward, they should be paid for by the people they represent, or in order to be able to serve in the best interest of whoever they represent, whether it's individuals, whether it's communities. So that, to me, I think is the fundamental service. So in the same way that we pay our financial intermediaries through commission, which is problematic in this case, but I think there should be a fees. One of the models that we've explored extensively is the idea of union dues, which is a fees that people give as part of their membership to the union. So you could do that in the example that Udbhav mentioned, if it's a data trust that is also a data union, you could have the members pay. Some of the models that we're seeing as cooperatives also deploy this membership fees, which makes sure that the steward is sustainable, but also is not commodifying the data, because that's something that we need to be quite concerned about, because in the way that stewards are imagined right now and trust, they're likely to be data holders and also likely to create some kind of value added services on that data. So the business model needs to be such that it incentivizes the best interest of the community and the individuals, and not the commodification of data. We've seen some other models as well where the profits are rolled back and then the community uses that to pay the steward. So there is something there that needs to be worked out. So, and I also don't think, I agree with Sharad about the public investment, and that may be required to get these things off the ground. But at the same time, I have a huge amount of discomfort with the idea that the government may be a data trustee. That's a hard red line that should not be crossed.
Right.
So that's why the financial or the business model of the data steward becomes an interesting problem to solve, because it is not something that can be funded by philanthropies, because that's not sustainable in the long term. It's not something that Google or any big tech can fund, which is the concern that everybody had with the sidewalk model in Toronto, which is that it was funded by big tech. So that's also out of the door. And the government, as well, as Udbhav pointed out, that there are lots of backdoors for the government in the current design of the PDP and also now with the NPD. So that's also not a great stakeholder. They may be able to create some of the protocols and technologies that Sharad mentioned, but should not be actively stewarding data. So that's why the only feasible financial model is where we as a community pay for the services of a data steward, because that is critical. And now increasingly there's a demand for these services, right? Like drivers everywhere are organizing so that they can have better access to their data. And they are pretty much at the forefront of this certain kind of data-driven exploitation in the current sort of digital economy. So that offers us some insight into what's possible.
So community-based payments and financing, you think is at least at the moment in a very nascent stage, the least sort of, how do I put it, worst alternative moving. Okay, great. Good to see some optimism. Udbhav, and last question from me before I open to the audience questions, is keeping this in mind of government versus markets. We've seen the wide exemptions that government has given itself in terms of access to data in law. How do you see that playing out with the data trust model, right? Because inherently data trust is supposed to be some sort of a fiduciary that either enables individuals or communities. But how do you think the law end of things will play out? Even what Astha was saying earlier in terms of being uncomfortable with entrenchment of government and government financing. So do you think this will be left alone for markets to operate, or will we see some prior, as we saw in the previous laws on data trust?
I think that we should certainly see prior intervention in laws and regulations that make it harder for the government to interfere unnecessarily, and at a minimum hold them to a very high standard of accountability when it comes to all alternative forms of data governance, and data trusts, I think, are just like one of them. And through the course of this conversation, we've discussed many of those, but I think for each and every one of them, we really need to understand that like the power and control that a government has when it has the influence in the operation of a data trust and what is done with that data is probably far superior to when they have such access to personal data that third parties may be collecting, right? Like, so for example, as a government, I may be able to order these 100,000 phone numbers or these 100,000 email accounts need to be tapped, right? Or I may be able to conduct mass surveillance. That's the traditional sort of idea of surveillance that we've associated with like, and problem with government exemption. But I think with data trust, it's much more dangerous because not only will I have access to that data, I can actively direct that data and exploit it in manners that I deem the most beneficial, right? Like, just to give you an hypothetical example, just like, let's imagine that there is a tender that the Indian government puts out 5 years from now that says there are 15 tribes located in these localities of a particular state in India, and the data about how they live their lives, what products they traditionally consume, will be available for any sort of, say, private entity to bid for and to develop products for that region, right? Like, you can automatically imagine in that like super small two-sentence example, what are the different ways in which things can go wrong, right? Like how close certain private parties are to the government. Like what are the checks and balances that are available when these private parties get access to that data? Will the government continue storing the data? What forms of accountability will exist? And none of this is per se covered in the personal data protection bill either, right? Because all of this can also happen on a non-personal data angle. So I think that like, because of the fact that it will empower the government even more than the personal data protection bill will to like do whatever it wants with information, I think we should ask for a very high standard of accountability. I completely agree with Astha's sentiment around like there should be certainly certain aspects of data trust that they should be completely excluded from, like that they shouldn't be involved in it at all. And even when they are involved, it should be at a really high threshold where, for example, like there are various regulators in India, and like I think it's common knowledge that some regulators are more effective than others and some have more independence than others. I think whichever regulator ends up being responsible, and it's most likely going to be the Data Protection Authority for this like alternative forms of data governance, needs to be very separate and independent from the government and be empowered enough to enforce these regulations against private parties who may go afoul of them.
Thanks, Udbhav. That was helpful. Again, no very clear answers in terms of how it will play out, but certainly the sentiment is stronger across the panelists. I will go on to questions now. And before I take the broader questions around non-personal data and social hierarchies, let me just take the question that's more specific from Vasant. And Sharad, this is specifically addressed to you. That does the ad model in US make it fundamentally incompatible with the notion of a public digital infrastructure? Can the US pivot towards PDI? What would be the equivalent of GPS that should become PDI of the future?
So GPS is not a great example, but essentially, I think I want to contrast, at least when it comes to personal data. Since we have not taken the approach and I'm referring to DEPA, which, luckily the bill is compatible with. So DEPA is an architecture, data empowerment and protection architecture, and the bill, if you see them as a combination, if they're implemented together, then one of the things in India is that there is a federated data concept. So if, let's take as an example, health records, instead of all my data, my personal longitudinal health data existing in one place, it exists in many, many places. So if it exists in Apollo Hospital, it exists in other different places, I don't even aggregate it and centralize it for myself. And not only that, there is no central repository for all the health data, let's say like one exists in Denmark, right? Now that's very important in the Indian context. Very, very important for us to take that into account. Now, if you now want to, in this context, now offer a service like Facebook, right? Then you have to build a distributed app kind of a model. Now, luckily, this whole distributed app model is becoming very prevalent. And frankly, you and I live in a world that we experience distributed apps all the time, and that is called email. You could well have created a Facebook experience for the consumers that would have been exactly a distributed app experience. The only difference would have been that Facebook wouldn't have had that aggregated data to monetize it the way it is monetizing today, right? And so the driver for this was monetization. It's not technology that made it better. In fact, from a technological perspective, it would have been better to have implemented that as a distributed app, because that's the scalable architecture that you have. We've had that, we've had that we had Napster before we had centralized collections of music. We know this distributed app model works. So the answer to Vasant's question particularly is, will US migrate? The answer is no. Because I think we must recognize we have a certain advantage, because we don't have the payment legacy. We can embrace an instant payment system that is highly secure without having incumbents who will hold us back. And therefore, it takes a Google to go back and make a 40-page recommendation to the Fed and saying, please, why can't you get a UPI type system in the US, right? And it won't happen, because the incumbents are so powerful, right? So I think we have to stop listening and using the West as a reference point in these matters. Luckily in payments, they are using us as a reference point, right? But we have to kind of train ourselves a little bit to see we can do the same for data as we go forward. And I think for individual data, where it's data sharing, personal data sharing, I think that is possible. And I want to just help you out a little and take one of the questions that Anushka has picked up and answer that about the account aggregator, because sooner or later it will come my way. Then you don't need to come back to me at all if necessary. Is that how does it happen? See, why a techno-legal approach for account aggregator is important is because account aggregator and DEPA follows a principle called organs. It's open, revocable, it's granular, it's auditable, notifiable, and secure. Of which the fact it's revocable, even if I have over consented, I can revoke my consent at any point in time. Since it's granular, which means my over consenting is granular, right? It never happens like it happens in GDPR today. I've over consented and I've lost control of this thing, because there's no easy way to revoke that consent. It's not easily auditable by a third party at all, because it's not electronic data consent, right? And when it is used, nobody notifies you that, that you gave that consent and now that data was shifted to that other person. I did it in month 1, you gave the consent for 3 times and did it in month 2 and month 3. So you're knowing that has happened. Now this happens, we are used to this in payments. I given the consent, but when my money is debited from my bank account, I still get a notification. This system is there only in India, nowhere else in the world. Right. So now what happens is, even people who are new to the concept of informed consent are getting pings back, and their agents, if in this case the consent manager, have the tools available to be able to act as fiduciaries on their behalf. None of which is possible in GDPR. So by careful design of a techno-legal framework, we can achieve a lot here in India. We must think of data democracy by empowering our citizen in a way that we did back in 47. And that is possible. We gave, suffrage to women before some Western companies did. So we must realize that it is not a copy-paste architecture of the West that will solve our problems. We have to have the belief in ourselves to be able to do something from ground up and first principles ourselves. And we've done it for payments, we've done it for identity, we've done it for e-signatures. India does more e-signatures than any other country in the world. And majority of the e-signatures are feature phone-based e-signatures, believe it or not dongle, and it is as secure as the dongle-based system. So we have to have faith in our ability to come up with these solutions and take them forward.
Thanks, Sharad. That was very instructive. Astha, if I can come to you on the larger questions around data trust, right? And there are 2, and I know we're running short on time. It's possible we go 5 minutes over. But really quickly, the first question is around whether data trust will build a social hierarchy on the basis of the worth of that data and the role of social credit rating system. And the second is more broad around community data, whether genomic or genetic data is collected, is envisioned as community under non-personal data, and how will that play out? And I guess the motivation for that question is also that genetic data does not only give you information about an individual, but about a community. So then would you sort of, or at least a family of sorts, right? You could sort of trace multiple identities using one data point. So those 2 questions, over to you.
I'll just also quickly chime in on the account aggregators, because I also think that, I mean, currently the way that the account aggregators are designed, I think that they need to play a greater advisory role in the data transactions. I think that is fundamental and critical, because they should be in a position to say, like, this data point is required and this data point is not required. And that will also then justify their fees that the individuals can then pay and solve the business model question. Without that, I think Rahul Mathan calls them the learned intermediary in one of his papers. I think that also is an interesting space, because right now the way the account aggregator is just like a data flow mechanism. It's a pass through, and that is not a sufficient role for the consent manager. Now then, the question of the whether we think that it might build social hierarchies, like I said, I do not think that the way and this is again the question that you had asked, Prakhar, about the revenue models. I think that the way that the trust is organized should be done through the consent of the community, and the community should actually decide what model works for them. And I know this sounds totally like, but there is a lot of work that's been done on participative decision making around commons, right? Whether it's water, whether it's different kinds of natural resources, forests, etc. And I think there's a lot for us to learn on how we can organize communities around questions of commons, such that the decisions are participative and such that those social hierarchies don't get formed. At the same time, I also recognize that, communities, in the way that there are hierarchical offline, will be also hierarchical online. And there will also be cases where the interest of one community is at loggerheads with another community. And that's something that we need to think about more deeply and build some kind of, techno-legal framework to solve some of that. With regard to genome data being a community good, yes, it's a complicated answer, but I think it should not be non-personal data. It is personal data that can be stewarded collectively, and that is being done, by multiple models like health data cooperatives, where, there's an organization called Me Data, which is a cooperative where you have members who donate their health data to the cooperative and then collectively decide on whether it's being used or not. It's a non-profit and it does not generate income for itself. And so there are interesting models, but no, I think that the protections of personal data need to be there for any kind of community data. Governance can be changed in the way that it's managed.
Thanks, Astha. And also just to add to that, there are discussions, and the question was by Raghav, there are discussions around how data trust will be able to assign ownership on genetic and genomic data. And if you sort of subscribe to a certain definition of what is property and, go down the sort of John Locke framework, you will probably come to a conclusion that genomic data is very much individual and data trust will be able to operationalize that. But like the common sentiment on this webinar, too early to say anything about data trust at the moment. Udbhav, there is a question around the PDP bill, and which is that does section 64(3) of the PDP bill provide a possibility of a data trust or a case similar to ACDU in India? That's by Anushka. Could you tell us a little more about the section itself and then sort of answer that question?
Sure. I mean, I think that like the short answer to that question is that I think that it can, but I'm not sure whether it should, right? And the reason for that is that I think that the kind of protections, and just in this like 1 hour conversation, I think we've come up with so many criteria that need to be kept in mind when a trust is being created. Like all of them, like, is it an enabling provision? Yes, almost certainly. Is it a provision that I think encompasses the depth of regulation that such a law will need to necessarily encompass? I don't think so. And I think that on the basis of that, even if we do end up creating this say a data trust in India as a tentative model to try out under this provision, I'm reasonably certain the problems that it would run into will be far more than the benefits that it may actually give us, even as a tentative test case. So I think while section 64 does allow for it to take place, I don't think that we should do so. And if we do end up setting up a data trust, it should be so after a law that specifically talks about how these things will be governed is created, and then and then we should attempt to actually end up creating data trusts that operate within the paradigm of Indian law.
Thanks, Udbhav. I think there is one last question, and there's time for that that we can take and then close it there, which I'll pose to the three of you and just get your final comments on this. That is, how do we negotiate individual rights and agency in a model where there are collective rights over data? While the PDP empowers the individual, we need more thinking on how we can form communities around data and empower